I'm Fonzo.
And I'm Eliza.
And we're the co-host of Grown, a podcast from the Moth that shows we're never fully grown.
Growing up feels like a phase that should end at some point, but does it ever really? Whether you're 16 or 26 or 86, you're gonna have to deal with family drama, your body, and the type of person you want to be. So why not put it all out in the open and go through it together?
Join us every other week to deal with cringe, culture, and the courageous efforts of people like you to get grown.
Start listening today. Follow Grown on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.
I first got on the apps after the end of an almost 8-year relationship. Online dating was fully in its adulthood by then, and I'd missed how many of my peers spent their weekends catching giant fish and taking poorly lit bathroom selfies. Despite what everyone had told me about which apps were better for what, they all had one thing in common. The photo was king. Swiping left or right had me all up in my head about the amount of attention I was giving to how people physically presented themselves on these apps. What kind of assumptions was I making based on a couple of images? And why did this make me feel conflicted when everyone makes snap judgments about others' bodies all the time? It's because I knew that more often than not, those reactions told me much more about myself than about the people I yet to meet. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. If you grew up like me, reading bad 90s teen magazines like YM, you may remember a lot of advice about how to make him want you, and how lip gloss and a crop top were essential tools for feminine attraction. We're taught early that others are constantly reading our bodies. This is something Julianne Scott Pollock also took notice of as a young kid.
With spastic cerebral palsy, I used to have my back hunched and my knees and my feet facing each other and up on my toes in a way that was obviously read by other people as disabled, in ways that I would get looks of pity, looks of discomfort, and in so many ways just sort of erased from that idea of ever being attractive or being cute or all the things we call little girls growing up.
Julianne's now a professor in communication studies and the director of performance studies at UNC Wilmington. She spends a lot of time as a researcher thinking about what it means to live in a marginalized body. And that research has roots in her own experience. When she was 11 years old, she underwent a 2-year operation. It affected how she looked and how people treated her.
Suddenly at 13, with my back straight and my feet facing forward, even though I still had an obvious limp, people read it as a temporary injury. And so suddenly, my body, which had been in physical therapy since I was 2 when I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy and had very defined muscular structure, was read as athletic and temporarily injured. And so the amount of attention that was suddenly coming at me was a little bit overwhelming from people. I remember the first time walking into high school as a 13-year-old girl, and there was a group of boys standing in the corner nudging each other and laughing. And I thought they were making fun of my limp, and I didn't know what to do. I was new at this high school. And finally, one of them came over, and I was so braced for something really hurtful. And he asked me if he could show me where my class was. He could tell I was new here. And so suddenly I became this sexual being that people would flirt with from time to time. And it was almost jarring for me.
Even as Julianne got older and into more serious relationships, assumptions about her sexuality and her disability continued. In one relationship, she noticed that her boyfriend's parents treated her with a seemingly unfounded hostility.
One of my first boyfriends, and I would say this happened several times, his mother was really negative towards me. Her body language was just hostile. And I'm a communication person, and at first I was thinking, well, maybe I'm overthinking this, but it got to be after a couple of months, I'm like, she really does not like me. And so I finally asked him, I said, what is going on? And he said, well, I'm the oldest boy in this family, and she's just really upset that I seem to be getting serious with someone who can't have children naturally. And I was like, well, who are you getting serious with? You're dating me. Like, what's going on? And he's like, well, with you having cerebral palsy. And I realized we had never had the conversation that cerebral palsy in no way, shape, or form impacts my fertility. I've had 4 children conceived and given birth naturally. And I realized at that point that he just assumed that I was unable to get pregnant because I'm disabled, when that is in no way part of my diagnosis or challenges in life in any way. Also, that idea of like, even though you're sexual and I'm sexually attracted to you, there must be part of you that's broken in this way. And so where that question, there's many people that do not have visible disabilities or any disability at all that do struggle with fertility. And no one ever assumes that, like they automatically assume it with me when that is actually not a struggle I have at all.
As a petite person with a limp, Julianne also wondered about dates that seemed especially attracted to her disability and to caring for her. This kind of fetishization is something DRC Charrington also experienced as someone with spastic diplegic cerebral palsy.
I was dealing with someone who actually was going overboard in his care, and he was treating me like glass. And, I basically was like, you need to realize that I was disabled before I met you. I will be disabled after you leave. And, basically, if something is going wrong, I will let you know. But if I don't ever say that to you, then just assume that this is business as usual. I think that it plays into the idea that, people want to be kind, but then you get into, the very gray area where intimacy can go overboard and turn into infantilism.
DRC is an advocate and a doctoral candidate in English at The Ohio State University. He's a super charismatic storyteller, and he had one particular dating experience that fell smack into this fetish category when he was living in London. He told the story at a live event in Washington, D.C. in 2015.
So my introduction to David was this. "Merry Christmas, sexy," he typed. My response. Well, I don't know how merry it'll be because I'm by myself for Christmas, but thanks. And Merry Christmas to you too, I guess. David should have been like, "Thanks, man," in scene. But no, a mere 2 lines into our conversation, he responds with, "Well, baby, I'll be your Christmas present. Your profile says you're in London, so I'll call you from the airport on Tuesday." I think I was too busy fantasizing about Beyonce and fried chicken, because if I had seen that message, those plans would have been crushed. But by the time I did see it, when I went to type, "Wait, what?" I got, "The user has now logged off." This whole interaction had took place in less than 4 minutes. So fast forward 1 week, and this guy is coming up to my front door. I realize I have about 4 minutes worth of information on him. Is that a good enough background for a first date? 3 glasses of wine I had said, yes, it is. The spirit of Christmas inside me said, you should be open to new ideas. If you ever have that thought, let me tell you why that is a horrible idea. We were in the car, driving, and I had my hand on the door handle for an emergency exit. And I looked at this man who had inexplicably turned up on my doorstep. He was 40s, brown hair, green eyes, cute, medium stalkerish type. I could handle that. So I said, "David, why did you fly over here on a whim to come and see me?" He said, "Because I love that you cannot walk. It is so sexy to me." David was a devotee. Let me explain. Devotees are people who sexually fantasize people with disabilities even though they don't have one. They live to serve and receive great pleasure in doing so. Understand, being gay with a disability is significantly more difficult than being plain old regular gay. And that is the only time in history you will hear the phrase plain old regular gay, because sometimes glitter just isn't sparkly enough.
I cannot believe all of that went down on a first date. Definitely more wild than any of my online dating experiences. But it just further supports what we've said so many times on this podcast. Communication is key to good relationships, and it's one of the most difficult parts to get right. Julianne has some helpful takeaways to pass on. Because of her disability, she learned how to navigate physical and verbal communication in relationships in a very specific way, especially when it comes to sex.
I have a spastic cerebral palsy, which means my body tenses on its own without me meaning to tense. So while that is a nonverbal communication of stop, you're making me uncomfortable, for partners who would know my body, they would just assume, oh, that's nothing to pay attention to. She has cerebral palsy. That's just happening. So even a very attentive partner who cares about me and my comfort level, I would have to physically say, I'm really uncomfortable. You need to stop. That's hurting. That's why I'm tense. Please don't do that. So I feel like I've had to learn to be very verbal when it comes to intimacy with partners. I teach a first-year student seminar where we talk about consent in different points, and I realized that what I've learned to do because I have an atypical body is something that all partners would be safer if they just would do. And so that idea of not counting on people to read your signals and telling them and being assertive of what is and is not okay. So I think in that way, having an atypical body gave me that level of having to be more assertive, because I knew that people continually misread me.
In our world of digital dating, there's always the decision about what to say about yourself on a profile. Like what went down with DRC, how much goes said or unsaid in those first few messages can be a game changer. For folks who use wheelchairs, online dating opens up options for disclosure. Whether or not you choose to include your wheelchair in a profile picture and how much you talk about disability in the early stages of courting can be an evolving decision.
When I was younger, I wanted to avoid the conversation altogether. I didn't want to talk about my disability.
Ariella Barker is an attorney in New York and former Miss Wheelchair North Carolina. She used to say nothing about her disability before meeting a romantic match.
I felt like that was pointing out my defect because that's the way that others looked at it. I felt as though if my profile picture showed my wheelchair, well, then that would immediately turn them off. They wouldn't want to date me. I include it in the profile because I didn't necessarily feel as though it defined me. But later on, as I had one horrible experience after the next, or one traumatizing experience after the next, I realized that I wanted to have that conversation as soon as possible, for nothing other than to weed out potential heartbreak.
Ideally, that conversation ends in understanding. But DRC said ghosting is an issue even after establishing a good connection with someone.
People talk to me and they're like, oh, you're so witty and charismatic. Oh, and you look nice and you have a nice face and a nice body. And then you mention that you're a wheelchair user. 90% of the time, people will just log off or they just disappear. And it's frustrating because it's not like you haven't had a great conversation for 2 hours beforehand.
Tell me about kind of navigating that rejection. I mean, in the online world, it's a little bit different than in real life, I'm guessing.
Right.
But I mean, how do you navigate that for yourself? Because that seems so hurtful.
You know, as I've gotten older, that has become, it's like more of an understanding that, you know, these are people that I wouldn't want to deal with anyway. And so that's basically what I tell myself. It's that, you know, if you have a problem with this now, you know, I'm giving you my cards up front. And, you know, if you don't want to deal with it, that's fine. if anything, I just saved myself months and months and months or possibly years of shallow heartbreak that able-bodied people are going to find out at a later date, and I feel really sorry for them. And, that's what ableism is. It's like, I was born with this disability. It's society that has the problem with disability. It's not my problem to go back and tell somebody to fix.
Assumptions can lead to a lot of frustration for people with disabilities in the dating world. But this ignorance and judgment also leads to very real, very scary situations. People with disabilities are more likely to experience sexual coercion and sexual violence than those without. This is something I talked about with Ariella.
So many of us, 80% of women with disabilities, are sexually assaulted in our lifetimes. And it's because I think, we have the intersection of gender discrimination that becomes violent, as well as, ableism, because we're so vulnerable. And that combination creates an incredibly dangerous situation. And after first experiencing it, and for me, that first experience was actually a best friend. So that made it even more impactful. And so I systematically created a system with so many rules in place for my own dating life to protect my safety, to protect my heart, that I ultimately became in a situation where I had so severely limited the amount of people that I could date, or the forms of dating that I would accept, or the types of dates that I would do, or the situations that I would put myself in, that I ultimately erased all possibility of dating for myself, because essentially I ultimately had to remove every single category of men or situation out there.
Ariella made rules for herself that she could only date people she already had a relationship with, people she trusted, people that already knew she had a disability. But things kept not working out. It took a breakup for her to realize it wasn't something she was doing wrong or some rule that she had broken. It wasn't her problem. It was theirs.
The culminating event that kind of made me realize this was after dating someone who had been a very close friend of mine previously, and we'd become serious and we started talking about marriage, and then he immediately got very distant and ultimately ended things with me, saying that my disability was too much and he wasn't strong enough. I realized that it wasn't about me, and it wasn't about my decisions, and it wasn't about the situations that I was putting myself in. It was about them. It wasn't about me at all. And his statement that I'm not strong enough, that completely that completely answered everything for me. In my mind, my entire life, it was that I was not physically strong enough, and that disability made me defective to others. Those people were not strong enough mentally, emotionally, whatever it was, to deal with any challenge whatsoever in life.
All the members of my immediate family are able-bodied. We've just started talking about this topic in my family, and I highly recommend it. Just remember that your current physical ability is hardly guaranteed tomorrow. Julianne explains why best.
Remember that every person is in a mortal body that is going to change over time. Knowing that my husband very recently started having problems with his back as we're both approaching 40, and is dealing with also having a disabled body in some ways. All of us that live long enough will know what it means to live through a disabled body, because that's so situational. And I would realize that the older I get, the more I move through life, the more at ease with my disabled body the people are around me, because they're aging and their bodies are breaking down too.
My thanks to Kaya Finlay and Grant Holland-Mormont for producing this episode, and to Charlie Shelton-Ormond for editing. Thanks also to Scott Shrake and folks at the Story League for letting us use a piece of DRC's live storytelling. This show is sponsored by Weaver Street Market, a worker and consumer-owned cooperative selling organic and local food at 4 Triangle locations in North Carolina. Now featuring online shopping with next-day pickup. weaverstreetmarket.coop. Embodied is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC, a listener-supported station. If you want to lend your support to this podcast and WUNC's other shows on demand, consider a contribution at WUNC.org. Incredible storytelling like you hear on Embodied is only possible because of listeners like you. Lindsay Foster Thomas is WUNC's Director of Content. Jenny Lawson is our sound engineer. And the incredible theme music you're hearing right now is from Quilla. I'm Anita Rao on an exploration of our brains, our bodies, and taking on the taboo with you.